Once upon a time, in a galaxy far, far away. In the beginning, these are some of the most iconic beginning phrases in the English-speaking Western world that open up the doors of the imagination to the multiverse of stories. In children's literature, in movies, in scripture. You see, stories are important. Stories that we tell each other shape us in our identity, our values, our ethics, and our vocation. Stories remind us who we are. Stories remind us of the values that our community holds. Stories remind us how to treat each other well. Stories remind us of who we are meant to be in this world. In a previous video, I introduced the theological approach that suggests that a culture's sacred texts and important stories inform the culture's meta-narrative, and that these stories give us insight into the culture's worldview. In that video, linked up here, I used the framework that theologian N.T. Wright proposed, where there are 4 elements to look for: stories, symbols, cultural practices, and answers to worldview questions. In that video, I also suggested that sometimes we can identify these 4 elements in a new culture, but oftentimes we may not be able to find them readily. Instead, what you can more easily find are the stories that people tell each other. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the stories told through the media of children's stories and movies. Then we'll ask these 3 questions of the story. What are the values that are implicit in these stories? How do these stories contribute to cultural identity? What do these stories tell us about the cultural vocation? First, let's take a look at why stories are important. For most of human history, information has been shared through story. A good story helps people to interpret facts and abstract ideas and to see a bigger picture. Cognitive psychology studies have shown that a person will more likely remember a fact wrapped in a story because stories activate the auditory, the visual, and the kinetic parts of our brains. The auditory when we hear the story, the visual part when we imagine ourselves engaged in the story, and the kinetic part when we are transported and we identify with the characters in the actions of the story. Thousands and thousands of years ago, language started to develop and information was passed down from generation to generation through language and stories. Then thousands of years later, language began to be written down on surfaces like stone, clay, and wood. Then later on papyrus, leather, scrolls, and paper. Then these stories began to be written down to be passed down from one generation to the next. But well before the advent of the printing press, pamphlets, and books, the oral tradition can be found in most cultures. The profession of bard can be found in Celtic and South Asian Indian cultures. They were the original professional storytellers, verse makers, oral historians, and genealogists that were employed by patrons to retell and honor the activities and accomplishments of their ancestors. In the Middle Ages, bards and minstrels were not only part of the entertainment, they were also part of the culture makers and influencers of their day. In the 21st century, in many West African cultures today, the griots are the bards of their culture, and they're called the living archive of the people's tradition and history. In many cultures these days, television, film, theater, music, and literature have become the surrogate modes of transferring information through story. So first, let's take a look at children's stories and what they can tell us about cultures and their worldview. Here is a Ghanaian folklore story. You can access this page on the link below. Long, long ago, people didn't know anything. They didn't know how to plant crops, or how to weave cloth, or how to make iron tools. The god Nyame up in the sky had all the wisdom of the world. He kept it safe in a clay pot. One day, Nyame decided that he would give the pot of wisdom to Anansi. Every time Anansi looked in the clay pot, he learned something new. It was so exciting. But then greedy Anansi thought, I'll keep the pot safe at the top of a tall tree. Then I can have it all to myself. He spun a long thread, wound it round the clay pot, and tied it to his stomach. He began to climb the tree, but it was hard climbing the tree with the pot bumping him in the knees all the time. All the time, Anansi's young son had been standing at the bottom of the tree, watching. He said, "Wouldn't it be easier to climb if you tied the pot to your back instead, Baba?" Anansi tried tying the clay pot full of wisdom to his back, and it really was a lot easier. And in no time, he reached the top of the tree. But then he stopped and thought, "I'm supposed to be the one with all the wisdom, and yet here was my son, and he was cleverer than me." Anansi was so angry about this that he threw the clay pot down out of the tree. It smashed into pieces on the ground. The wisdom was free for everyone to share. And that is how people learn to farm, to weave cloth, to make iron tools, and all the other things that people know how to do. Anansi is a typical West African and Caribbean folklore figure who often takes the shape of a spider and is considered to be a trickster. As we read this story, what might it tell us about the Ghanaian culture's values, identity, and vocation? In this story, we could say that the cultural good of wisdom is not meant to be hoarded, but to be shared as part of the community for the benefit of the community. Even when the valuable is used to place one person over and against the others, reaching the heights of the gods, something will happen that will bring the proud person low. We could also say that there might be implicit belief in arbitrary and fickle gods who distribute blessing to some, but not to others. Are you familiar with this folklore? What else could we say about the West African values, identity, and vocation from this story? Now, a second story is a Japanese story called Pankun's Pancakes by Chisato Minami, and the story can be accessed in the link below. Today's snack is pancakes. As the butter melted and the syrup wafting into his nose, Pankun was drooling, ready to eat. Itadakimasu. Just as he was about to take a bite, ping pong! Shirokun was at the door. "I brought freshly picked peppers." "Oh, thank you. I just made pancakes. Want some?" Of course. And so the pancake was cut in half. Itadakimasu. Just as they opened their mouths, ping pong! It was Montaro and Monchiro. "We brought some freshly picked carrots." "Oh, thank you. I just made pancakes. Want some?" With pleasure. And so the pieces were cut in half. Itadakimasu. Just as they opened their mouths, ping pong! It was the Pensky brothers. "We brought some freshly picked onions." "Oh, thank you. I just made pancakes. Want some?" Hooray! Hooray! And so the pieces were cut in half again. Itadakimasu. Just as they opened their mouths, ping pong! It was the Butamaru family. "We brought some yummy rice." "Oh, thank you. I just made pancakes. Want some?" Happy to. And so the pieces were cut in half again. Itadakimasu. Just as they opened their mouths, ping pong! It was the Popoto family. "We brought some eggs." "Oh, thank you. I just made pancakes. Want some?" Thanks. And so the pieces were cut in half again. Itadakimasu. Just as they opened their mouths, ping pong! It was the Nyangoro family. "We brought some freshly picked tomatoes." "Oh, thank you. I just made pancakes. Want some?" That would be harmonious. But this time, Pankun was worried. The pieces were so small and couldn't be divided anymore. And what's more, he's run out of milk and syrup. He can't make any more new pancakes. But then Pankun had a brilliant idea. "With all the veggies and eggs, let's make a yummy dish." Pankun chopped up the peppers. He chopped up the onions and the carrots. He diced the tomatoes. He cooked the rice. He stir-fried the veggies and rice. He put the tomatoes into a large pot. He added a little bit of seasoning to the tomato sauce. He scrambled the eggs. With the sizzling pan, he fried the eggs over and over. Then he plated the fried rice on the eggs over and over. And then he wrapped the egg onto the rice over and over. Then he poured the tomato sauce. And in no time at all, here were fluffy omelette rice. Hooray! With the table set, itadakimasu. Just as they opened their mouths wide, ping pong! It was the Keromaru family. We brought hotcakes. That's great, thanks. We just made omelette rice. Want some? Of course! And so they split the omelette rice and the hotcakes in half. Everyone had a pleasant meal. So even in this simple story with lots of repetition, there are at least 5 cultural values that could be identified. Firstly, there's the value of hospitality and generosity of the host to slave over a meal to show honor to the guests. Secondly, there's the value of gift giving, where everyone contributes something to show honor to the host. Thirdly, there's inclusivity, that everyone is welcome at the table, so to speak. Fourthly, there's thankfulness for the meal. The repeated phrase itadakimasu is not easily translatable. It carries with it the connotation of thanking the living thing, such as the vegetables, eggs, and rice, for dying so that others might partake of them and live. This is rooted in the 5th value, respect for life, both human and non-human life. And as a bonus, there's the value of being good at math. I've never encountered in any children's story a progression that is an exponential increase. Most children's stories progress linearly, but the simplicity of the story made it natural to add 1, plus 1, plus 2, plus 4, plus 8, plus 16, plus 32, plus 64, and it equals 128. Now let's turn to television and film, which are undoubtedly 2 of the largest modes of storytelling and culture influencing. With all of the variety and the sheer number of films produced in the 100 years or so of cinema, it will take a film critic to unpack an extended discussion on how movies have reflected the values, cultural identity, and vocation of a culture, or how they have influenced change in the worldview of cultures over the years. Here, we will limit our discussion to 2 possible topics. The first is how film and television have reflected the evolving cultural values of the time. And we can notice the emphases and the changes over time. Take, for example, this montage of action shows and movies. These were the shows and movies that I grew up with in the 80s and 90s.
Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?
Yippee-ki-yay, mother...
What are you?
I'm Batman.
Michael Knight, a young loner on a crusade to champion the cause of the innocent, the helpless, the powerless, in a world of criminals who operate above the law.
Should have been somebody else. Believe it or not, I'm walking on it.
Then, in the last 20 years, there's been a shift in the zeitgeist that's reflected by how popular these new shows and movies are.
Last week, most of us were strangers, but we're all here now. If we can't live together, we're gonna die alone.
Now you've probably noticed how the first montage showed mostly shows and movies that focused on a single protagonist. And yes, you may have also noticed that they were all Caucasian males. This was to show that that was the avatar of the baby boomer and Gen X generations in the Western world. Individuals having to pull up their bootstraps to man up and get her done. The second showed the generational and cultural shift. What became popular was the ensemble cast that became more and more diverse and reflected the diversity of the Western culture. Here, I'll make 3 comments. First, the protagonist is no longer the Lone Ranger, but the community of people of diverse backgrounds who will work together to do what's good and right and just. Second, there has been a shift between a clear demarcation of black and white, good versus evil plotline, to a more ambiguous blurring of the lines. More storylines explore the complexity of life to show how people can embody both good and bad intentions and motivations at the same time. Third, with a more diverse cast of characters and actors playing roles, the perennial concern of what does it mean to be human can be more fully explored. One of my favorite TV shows is Doctor Who, which has always had an optimistic, humanistic worldview in the DNA of the show. The Doctor is presented as a humanoid alien who strives to bring out the best in people. And the ones acting inhumanely are the robots that tend to have imperialistic tendencies of assimilating living beings to become like them. And the beast-like aliens that tend to let their impulsive, animalistic urges get the best of them, causing chaos and destruction in their wake. The Doctor and his companions have traditionally been exploring the question of what it means to be human from an Anglo-Saxon worldview lens. In the current series, that question is being explored from a female Doctor point of view, from a companion who is differently abled, from an immigrant point of view, and from a companion who has suffered deep loss. Now, the second topic that we can introduce is how stories in film and television can try to be culture influencers and change makers. One important example to explore is the attempt to restore and reignite the African American mindset. For too long in American history, from the slave trade to segregation, the African American people have been disenfranchised and devalued. While there is much more to say about racism, bigotry, and systemic injustice, the African American story has had to face a dual uphill battle, both from the outside forces that threaten to continue keeping the black and brown bodies and mind down, and from the inner struggle of restoring self-worth and identity. To address the former, there are many films and shows that have tried to educate the masses of the injustices of racism and bigotry suffered by African Americans over the decades. Some of the more compelling ones of recent years are Watchmen and Lovecraft Country. Watchmen slowly weaves in the 1921 Tulsa Massacre and takes that horrifying black experience and wraps it in the comfort blanket of a superhero story. Lovecraft Country similarly describes the horrifying experience of African Americans during the Jim Crow era in the South, but this time wrapped in the Lovecraftian sci-fi, fantasy, and horror genre. For those of us who've never experienced lynching, mob violence, and discrimination, these stories, as psychologists suggest, transport us into their world and we begin to identify with the perspective and identity of the characters in the story. One result, hopefully, would be these stories affect how we empathize with others. We can move one step closer to understanding what the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the victims of systemic injustice, and the traumatized have gone through and the struggles they might be dealing with. To address the latter, about elevating the cultural self-worth and dignity, I noticed about 15 years ago how there was a series of movies that came out that tried to do this in the guise of sports and academic competitions. Not only were these movies well scripted and well acted, these movies were both commercial and critical successes. You might have seen some or all of these movies. Remember the Titans in 2000, Ali in 2001, Coach Carter 2005, Glory Road in 2006, Akeelah and the Bee in 2006, and The Great Debaters in 2007. Here's a powerful clip from The Great Debaters.
Anybody know who Willie Lynch was? Anybody? Raise your hand. No one? He was a vicious slave owner in the West Indies. The slave masters in the colony of Virginia were having trouble controlling their slaves, so they sent for Mr. Lynch to teach them his methods. The word lynching came from his last name. His methods were very simple, but they were diabolical. Keep the slave physically strong, but psychologically weak and dependent on the slave master. Keep the body, take the mind. I and every other professor on this campus are here to help you to find, take back, and keep your righteous mind.
And here's a quote that was used in both Coach Carter and Akeelah and the Bee.
Go over there and read the quotation that's on the wall. Read it aloud, please.
Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same.
Does that mean anything to you?
I don't know.
It's written in plain English. What does it mean?
That I'm not supposed to be afraid.
Afraid of what?
Afraid of me.
These are just some of the ways in which stories are important in conveying and changing worldviews by reminding us of our identities, our values, and our vocation. Worldview stories inform and remind us who we are meant to be in the world, how we are meant to be in the world, and what we are meant to do in the world. I hope that through these stories, we might seek out stories that tell of other experiences. How might we better hear the stories of the First Nation indigenous peoples of North America? What about the stories and experiences of racism and bigotry among Asian and Pacific Islander peoples? How might we step into the experiences of the marginalized and the disenfranchised among us? What about the stories that concern immigrants, refugees, and the diaspora of a people group? What are the stories of those who are most vulnerable among us, who live with homelessness, addiction, or mental health concerns? And how might we better hear the voices of the LGBTQ2+ community who have faced their own marginalization, discrimination, and disenfranchisement? So what do you think? What are other examples where stories describe worldview? What are other examples where stories have become culture influencers and change makers? Share your thoughts down below, subscribe today, and as always, you can check out more videos right now. Until next time, Shalom v'chesed v'emet, my friends.